All right. Well, welcome. Today we have the highly esteemed and highly intelligent Alexander John Shaia. Thank you for being willing to spend your time with me. This is lovely. Thank you.
John, I've been looking forward to this, so thank you for the invite.
Oh. Um, so, Alexander, I have been a fan of Quadratos. Is that how you pronounce it? Close enough?
Close enough.
For a while, ever since I actually listened to some of your first interviews on the Robcast. I thought, man, the way that you were talking about faith and the way you were talking about spirituality was just resonating with me deep within. But some of the people that I talk to and that listen to this maybe don't know of your work. But if you could you explain some of the things that you do? How would you define yourself?
Lifelong devout Christian. Went to the University of Notre Dame in the 1970s, and for all your Penn State fans, I ask your patience. And while there, I was on my way to seminary, which I eventually went to briefly after I graduated. But while at the university, I had the privilege of listening to a series of lectures that Joseph Campbell gave. He came every springtime to teach in the theology faculty, which I found so
Really?
exciting. Yes,
Not literary.
no. He was teaching Hebrew and Christian scripture as sacred myth. And this is in the early 1970s, and he
Ooh.
spun the world totally. This was also at exactly the same moment that in my scripture work at Notre Dame, I was learning that the ancient first 500 years of Christianity, they had read the four Gospels in a definitive cycle.
Hmm.
And the cycle is not the way that we see them in the Bible today.
Mm.
And I heard Joseph Campbell say to me in his lectures over and over again that every great human story of transformation has four parts to it. Worldwide, across era,
Hmm.
you cannot reduce the story of transformation into less than four major parts.
Mm.
At the same point, I'm in my scripture work hearing about this ancient four-part gospel, and that in our early tradition, they never spoke of them as plural, they spoke of them as singular. And they definitely seemed that they had a way that they understood how the four fit together to form a larger story.
Hmm.
So these two things happening sort of simultaneously in 1972, 1973 started me on a journey which finally came to some ripeness in the year 2000. So that whole time I'm trying to discover, is there a way that makes sense to me at least that these four stories form what Campbell talked about, the journey of human transformation,
Hmm.
but also that our earliest ancestors understood were not four different stories of Jesus,
Mm.
but were a continuous story of, my words now, the spiritual journey that we're all on.
Uh-huh. And so
So
that took you decades then.
well, it really took me my whole life, but absolutely from about 1972 to the year 2000, I kept
Wow.
digging and praying and researching, and a couple of times I thought that it made sense, but I realized that I was sort of pushing the foot into the shoe, and I backed off, and it was like, if there's something here, it had to fit just seamlessly and easy. And that finally happened. That finally arrived for me in the year 2000.
Can can I ask what was the moment like when you realized that in 2000?
It
Was
was a
it a
day
moment?
that it was all day, All Saints Day in the year 2000.
Yes.
And I was in northern New Mexico. I was staying at the retreat center called Ghost Ranch,
Hmm.
owned by the Presbyterian Church. And I had spent the day hiking.
Mm.
And I came back to my cabin at night, tired physically tired, but my mind was like racing.
Uh-huh.
And and this friend had just given me a book in Christology, and I thought for sure this would help me go to sleep.
It
And
didn't it didn't put you to sleep, did it?
I opened the book, which was the Reverend Robin Griffith Jones's work called "The Four Witnesses,"
Hmm.
and in this book he summarizes the research at that point that we about the four communities
Hmm.
when each of the gospel was written to them.
Hmm.
And that was it. When I saw that narrative, it took me all the way back through my everything that I've learned about spirituality, and I recognized that each community was wrestling with a very specific question. And the question was, they were already a believer in Jesus. The question was, tell me how to be a better follower. Tell me how to live
Oh.
question in this moment.
Hmm.
And the four questions that I saw in the narrative that Robin Griffith Jones gave us, there was Joseph Campbell's The Journey of.
Wow.
And so all the threads, all my psychological, all my spiritual, all my theological, everything in that moment just became this seamless garment.
Oh, that's beautiful. Hmm.
And I stayed up 2 days and 2 nights.
You didn't sleep at all?
I I didn't sleep at all. I was just I had this huge yellow. I mean, this is long before I had an iPad or any of that. I had a legal pad and a pen and
Wow.
10-watt bulb in this little cabin, and I was trying. I was reading the scriptures and I was writing notes because it was as if I had never seen these words before, even though I had memorized them, pretty much memorized the
Yeah.
gospel as a child. What I was reading in that moment was an entirely new level of understanding. And it was the most exciting moment in my life and also the most terrorizing moment
What made
because,
what made that terrorizing?
well, because it was like, who the hell are you to have a different way to see the gospels after all this time?
Oh, wow. Uh-huh. But if
Could this be true? Am I really seeing this or am I making this up? I mean, it's like you want to believe now. 22 years later,
Mhm.
I have settled for myself in what I think is the bedrock truth of what arrived all those years ago.
Wow.
But I totally understand why someone else would go, I don't know about this stuff.
Yeah. Well, as you were talking right there, it also reminded me of sometimes I don't know how to pronounce her name, Mechtilde of Madberg, one of the mystics. She said that the day of my spiritual awakening was the day I saw God in all things and all things in God. But that was after years of already being a nun. And then she had her awakening. And one of the things I get from you, but I also get from people similar to like Ken Wilber and some just an evolutionary Teilhardian spirituality is that things new things can still come forward, new things can still blossom. It's not this locked in system of this is what's always been said, always say it this way, this is the safe way. But spirit's not about safe in that way.
Yeah.
Wow.
To, to me, the Gospels are so profoundly true
Hmm.
that they must be true in 1,000 ways. That great truth is not singular, it is expansive.
Wow.
And that as we psychologically and spiritually grow and understand more,
Hmm.
then gospels must lead us forward.
I'm gonna have to think about that for a long time now. Maybe not for 2 days, but I I did my second master's at Princeton, and I had some emphasis in there on developmental theories, such as Eric Erikson and some of these others. And so the way that psychology and spirituality can overlap is really quite wonderful in my estimation. And I don't understand why more people don't talk about it in that way. But as I think about some of what you just said, like spirit can say 1,000 different things through the same text, the same truth in 1,000 different ways, but you may not be ready to hear it in that way yet. And that's a part of the path too, is learning how to, especially people who are religious leaders in some capacity, right? You have to learn how to notice the level that someone's at, and the is it the kind of truth? Is it how do you discern what kind of level of spirituality a person's ready for? Do you any insight?
Well, certainly, as I am now in my 70s, what I understand about love is different than what I understood in my 50s, is different from my 30s, is different from when I was 6 or 7 years old. Love is still true,
Mm.
but the way that I understand it and the way that I respond to it, I hope, is much wider and deeper.
So there is a receptivity part as well.
There's a reality part, and there's a developmental part.
How is that? How is
Well,
it
just
developmental?
well, when I look at humanity over the last 500 years, um, about 500 years ago, we began to be extremely intelligent in terms of critical analysis.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And our understanding of the gospel grew in that moment.
Mm-hmm.
Now we're at a point where we're bringing that critical analysis back together with devotion and heart and passion.
Oh wow.
And, and to me, the gospel has got to, I mean, to me, the gospel does hold all of that.
Mm.
It's always been there waiting for our receptivity.
Mm. Which do you mind if we shift to Nicodemus then? That
Sure.
was beautiful. Is as I was reading your book at the same time that I felt as though I was going through some shifts within myself. And I came across a definition of conventional that says the conventional is the agreed upon practices and habits of a community at the expense of individuality. And the need to belong is a it's a beautiful thing, it's a good thing, it's not bad. But when you do that for too long at the expense of your own individuality, your own self-expression, that can be a problem. Anyways, I came across that at the same time that I was casually reading about Nicodemus. And I thought, my gosh, here is someone who, for him, it was like a developmental shift forward to join a community, join the Pharisees, got paid for them, had housing probably, right? But then he goes to meet Jesus at nighttime because he doesn't want his buddies to know. But he starts to have this, is it a post conventional understanding of his own Judaism? And then, of course, I read your chapter on Nicodemus. I'm like, oh, that's exactly what's going on. He's feeling this pull into a not a different faith, but a different expression of the same faith. And I would love to hear you riff on that if that's possible.
Well, the, the, this third chapter of John is to me one of the most critical chapters in all four of the Gospels. And it's so much of the dilemma that Christian traditions are having at this moment.
Interesting.
So
Okay.
here's how I understand it. First of all, I think of the text of John as being the text of what I call the third spiritual path. So, in the third spiritual path is the moment that you have a larger awakening, or you see a larger vision, or you have a wider perspective on yourself, on God, on life. And what we also know is at that very moment, uh, which is what I call the beautiful dangerous. And it's the beautiful dangerous because we have this opening and there is something in us, and I don't know why there is something in us. It's like one of those questions I've got from God is, why is it that when we have this opening, something in us tries to pull us away from it or pull us back from it? There,
Yes.
there is an inner struggle that happens, and to the larger the vision and the larger new life that we're given, the larger the resistance or the larger the pushback, however you want to say that.
Okay. Wow.
To me, this is what is happening for Nicodemus. Nicodemus is being drawn, and again, from my perspective, let's set the context for this gospel. It's, I think, coming out of the community of Ephesus, late first century. Ephesus is a community which is widely diverse,
Hmm.
including a very articulate, intelligent women's community. It's also a community which is affluent because it is the center of the Roman slave market. And you have gleaming Ephesus up above, and you have the slaves below the city locked in caves. And you've got this tension in the city itself.
Mm.
Ephesus, founded either by Paul or by one of the disciples of Paul, has heard the message in the 40s of the 40s of the first century.
Uh-huh.
They've heard the message about the one breath of God that calls everyone to be brother and sister to each other. It's like they got the beatific vision of a whole new understanding of everything.
Yes. Uh-huh.
Now, let's 50 years later, when this gospel is composed at the end of the first century,
Hmm.
it's all fallen apart. All the jealousies, all the sense of privilege, all the competition between tribes and peoples and genders, all of that has resurfaced, so much so that Ephesus, the community that saw themselves as the New Jerusalem, has become the community of great delusion.
Wow.
Thinking that the beatific vision that Jesus announced is not true. And now John, in this, what I think of is one of, if not the greatest spiritual text ever revealed to us,
Yeah, absolutely. Uh-huh.
is going to show that the tensions and the competition and the who's in the in group and who's in the out group and all that stuff is always with us, but it is not the really real.
It's an illusion.
It's an illusion.
Okay.
It doesn't feel that way. It feels real,
Of
but
course.
ultimately it's an illusion. And so this gospel, chapter by chapter, and I hope I live long enough, if I have the grace, to write a book on how the Gospel of John is the manual for for a community that is built on an authentic diversity, not a uniformity.
Oh, wow. Which then is consistent with later on in John's gospel. Was it 16 or 17? I pray that they might all be one.
Absolutely.
That the ruach has been poured out on all people, old, young, men, women, and that's Old Testament principle. That's
You
not a
see,
New Testament verse.
no, but and the newness here is the fullness of the Hebrew roha, in the sense that the Hebrew world believed that all people are one before God, but they never went that extra step to say that we could invite the world's diversity to sit at table together.
Oh, wow.
It was like you you will be before the same God in your house, and we'll be before the same God in our house.
Hmm.
Beautiful. But Ephesus is that first place that we have a record of of stepping beyond that and opening the door and saying, doesn't matter who your mother was,
Mhm.
doesn't matter your bloodline, doesn't
Right.
matter if you were slave or free. To Ephesus, which has got the slaves under their feet, doesn't matter whether you are slave or free. Doesn't matter
That's
whether you're
right.
from Africa or India or come. We have a table.
Oh, wow. Which to me, that brings back when Jesus brings up the Spirit blows where it wills. It will not listen to any of the lines that you've drawn or that your community has drawn. And it's,
So, and this is in response to Nicodemus.
uh-huh, yeah.
So here's the sadness with Nicodemus.
Hmm.
For me, he is clearly drawn towards this new, wider sense of not who God is so much as who we can be as as
Okay.
as 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 people of the one breath. But
Oh,
but
yeah.
he's caught now in his own tradition when he says to Jesus, "How can someone be born again?" This is tribal understanding. This is there, we can have all the mystical discussions about this, and those are all true. But at core, what Nicodemus has said to Jesus is, our tradition knows that we have the first promise to know Yahweh
Oh, yeah.
because we have the blood of a Jewish mother in us. Jesus, I see your goodness, but by what authority do you go out and say everybody's bloodline
Hmm.
has that first privilege? How can you put somebody who's not Jewish in a Jewish mother's body and give them Jewish blood?
Yeah. So it's really a conversation about lineage.
Lineage and tribalism.
I don't think I've ever heard it defined that way.
Well, but you have to understand that tribalism was a pan tribal understanding of God was the first gift of Ephesus.
Hmm. Okay.
That that 50 years later they're losing, and John's got to bring them back again to the vision and the sense of God that was there for them when they first heard the gospel.
I have a question then. Because it sounds as though Ephesus had this understanding of being people of the one breath, but over 50 years they lost it. And I think about the Hebrew scriptures and how 40 is often understood as a generation, right? The number 40. And as I think about that, that's a consistent struggle of every generation to pass on this insight that we are all the one people of the one breath. But what is it that every generation we keep going back to a tribal understanding of Yahweh rather than this unitive more than global, it's cosmic, right? What is, but maybe that's that pull backwards that we feel that you already mentioned.
And it's why this entire gospel, step by step, chapter by chapter, answers that question. And I like to, why is it that in the second chapter of this gospel do we have Jesus cleansing the temple? Because this is the story of the third spiritual path, and the first thing when you have wider vision arrive for you,
Hmm.
the first thing that you must do with that is that you must scourge clean the old vision,
Mm.
kind of scrub, because until your lens from the old vision is cleared, you cannot truly see the brilliance of the new. And so, right here in the second chapter, the gospel author has given us the premise for the rest of the book.
Oh my gosh.
And then the next chapter is going to give us the first figure that we have to look for as we want to cleanse our vision, which is Nicodemus,
Who is a member of that temple.
who's a member of that
Wow.
temple,
And
and and who is caught. I mean, he is us. We're drawn to the larger, we're drawn to the radiant, and there's something in us that pulls us back or
wow.
pulls us. And I
Oh,
love that the story of Nicodemus is not resolved. I mean, whereas the rest of the figures in this gospel often go 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 through transformation, show change.
mm-hmm.
The story of Nicodemus stops, and you're not quite sure what Nicodemus decides.
That's right. And when I was reading uh, your chapter on John's gospel, which it's my favorite gospel, not just because I share a name with it, it's literally my favorite, but you also helped me to understand uh, the man that was born blind differently. And you have this emphasis that this gospel is really about spiritual blindness and spiritual sight. And when we read these scriptures, like you said, with a critical analysis or historical analytical lens, we're taking a text that's deeply mystical and trying to understand it in this historical critical method, and it loses its it's not that it's lost all of its wisdom, but it loses some of its, I don't want to say magic. Is that the right word? It's enchantment, you know?
I mean, to me, this, and I'm with you. This, although as I was writing the book, I fell in love with each of the four,
Oh yeah.
but my heart goes back to John because John changes everything. There's
Yeah.
a whole journey to get to John, and there's a whole journey that flows out of John. But if you really, really get John, it changes everything. And 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 it is so it's so what's the word I'm looking for? Um, some of our scholars today have mistakenly understood John in a very narrow way
Hmm.
because they think the Greek world was so wonderful. And they don't understand that John is speaking Greek to deconstruct the Greek and bring people back to an Aramaic Hebrew understanding of the
Wow.
universe.
Which,
For
go ahead. Yeah.
you can't in Jesus in Aramaic and Hebrew you could never have a statement like the light must overcome the dark.
Hmm.
You have broken God apart in that statement. You have spoken
Right.
heresy. Light and dark must live together because they are from God and of God.
Yeah. And that goes back to your comment about integrate, obviously. This
Yeah.
heavy emphasis. Now, I here's can I share with you just a quick thought? I don't want it to you're the star, really, not me. But
No.
I I feel as though I went to seminary and I learned a lot of good theologians, but I had the mystics referenced, but I never studied. And so when I finished seminary 10 years ago, I just started clockwork going through a different mystic, sometimes two a year for like the past 10 years, deep dives. And I've always thought, my gosh, these people have got it. But then at one point, I actually went back and I was looking at Ephesians, which we're talking about Ephesus quite a bit. And in Ephesus, in chapter 1, there's a Greek word, anakephalaioseistai, which I'm a word nerd. But it means the gathering up of all things under the headship. Kepha meaning head, right? And I thought to myself, my God, here's a verse that I've literally never heard a sermon about. and I've been
Mm.
going to church since I was born. And so I'm also fascinated by how we in the Western world, we kind of pick and choose what are the verses we choose to highlight, and even lectionaries do this. But coming across that singular Greek word reframed everything for me. Everything is going to be gathered up, united, brought together in Christ. I'm like, what are we doing, people?
Right.
My
Right.
goodness.
And, and if I can say it this way, everything already has been.
Everything's already been united.
Yes.
Okay.
And we've got to go through the journey to make what's really real true.
To do away with all the divisions, to work against the separations.
So if you go back to the first line of John,
Mm-hmm.
in the beginning was the Word, except that we could, and we know that logos in the Jewish Greek world is everythingness or veriness or allness. But if you put that back into the first lines of Genesis,
Mm.
and another way to understand word is breath.
Because a word
Every,
is speech, and you breathe when you speak. Okay.
but we can equally say in our best Hebrew that God breathed the world. And actually, the even better way is not past tense, but present tense. God is breathing the cosmos at this moment. And what John is saying is that that outbreath of God is a visible manifestation of the Christos.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
We look out at the cosmos, we are seeing one of the visible manifestations of the Christ. And
That
every
feels like that
cell,
settles so nicely within me when I hear that.
yeah.
That it's
And
like,
it takes me back to, because I'm a ritual nerd. And I would really like our scholars to study more the baptismal rite of the first
mhm.
500 years of Christianity. When people came up out of the font from baptism, all of those gathered around were chanting one of two things. They chanted your name followed by a Christ or in Christ,
I have,
realizing that there's only one the Christ.
uh huh.
But baptism is our response to what is already true, that each particle of us is part of Christ.
The one body. Yes. I, in my class on Christian spirituality, I frequently make the comment that Christianity is, in some sense, the best pyramid scheme of all time.
Hmm.
What would it look like to have 8 billion, the way I phrase it is lowercase Christs, walking around the world, loving and healing and making it whole again? And I can sometimes in my college students see it a shift. Maybe they don't go fully into it because that requires a whole new metanoia, right? But I can see some of them, it almost as though it lures them. Like it's like they caught the scent of something better. Like, oh, it's not just this thing where we passively admire what the Christ has done, but instead, and it's so funny, we just quote the Bible back at people. It's Second Corinthians. You are a minister of reconciliation also. And the reconciling of all things. It's I feel as though I've had some massive shifts in my own understanding of Christian spirituality in the past 10 years, really, this long journey. And I can't go back. I can't put the toothpaste back in the thing. But why would I want to? Ah.
So, along with that, John, one of the most radical things that I do with the gospel text,
Mm-hmm.
I will not speak the gospel in past tense.
What do you mean by that?
Every passage of the gospel that I read, it's never Jesus said, it's Jesus says. It's never Jesus did, Jesus
Oh,
does.
interesting. Okay.
These texts are the eternal present moment texts of how the Christos lives.
Wow.
And the really amazing thing is that whenever I do this, people come up to me and say, "I've never heard that passage before." It's because as soon as we read that passage in the past tense, because we are people of the critical mind,
Yeah.
we put that as something that happened 2,000 years ago rather than as something that's happening right now.
Which then it leads to that separation. And if separation is the thing that we all need to recognize as the illusion, so um, I understand that through Quadratus, you help people find community or create community around this. Is that right?
We have a process called heart and mind, a
Mm-hmm.
heart and mind community, which is built upon you finding your true, authentic self in the midst of the gospel journey.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
Because
And,
what I think the greatest spiritual challenge of this century is a new form of community that we've just begun to imagine. Is
wow.
that rather than a community which is bonded together by sameness,
Mm.
going to be a community which revels in our authentic diversity.
In every capacity, in I mean, not just physically and age, whatever, but even what does it look like to have a spiritual community that's diverse?
Right.
Oh, because there's a lot of belonging and defining lines that's defined by creedal adherences.
Right. And the hallmark of this community is interiorizing the practice of freedom and safety.
Mm-hmm.
That we want to be people who are truly free and authentic. But now, what we also have to discover is how to have conversation that's respectful,
Yeah,
where we learn that truth often lives between rather than only in one perspective.
that's lovely. That sounds
It's
difficult as well.
it's utterly, this is the foundation of our spirituality.
Oh my goodness, yeah.
I mean, the first great artistic form of Christianity was an open door where the world's diversity could sit together as brother and sister.
Hmm.
But what they did that we don't do is, because baptism for them was something far beyond just membership. Baptism for them came at the end of a long process of learning how to be an effective member at table,
Right.
how to know my truth, but also how to respectfully put it in conversation with another.
Yeah. I've been having a lot of conversations. So I quit my church job in December
Mm.
of this past year because I felt this need in the world, but also I had this sense of calling, and I hope this doesn't sound arrogant, of like sentness. Because I've seen things and I can't unsee. I now see the world differently than I used to. And so I've walked outside of the formal structural conventions of church walls, I guess. But I've been meeting with people 6, 8 conversations a week similar to this. And it's lovely, while at the same time I hear a lot of people lament feeling like exiles for seeing the world in this way, which I would actually say is actually more Christian. And it's bittersweet to meet with someone else who also sees the Christian faith in this manner, yet they feel like they don't belong. Do you have any wisdom for some of those people? Because I I know that is a struggle for many people.
Um, it's a struggle, I think, for most people if they're honest. I
Okay.
think there's I think there's a way that every one of us, if we're honest with ourselves, feel like if everybody else knew, I don't know whether I would be so welcome at the table.
Oh, yeah.
And what, again, because I'm the ritual nerd, in those first centuries, when the community came together on Sunday or whenever they came together and they spoke their vulnerability.
Mm, right.
We we have that quote unquote as confession of sin, but it's not so much confession of sin as it is a confession of vulnerability.
A confession of vulnerability. Okay. Uh-huh.
That I have a need to be here with you. I have a need for you to understand that I'm on the way. I have a need to understand the presence of love in the fractured places of myself and amongst us.
That's right.
And what was the prayer of that moment? It was the Kyrie eleison,
Oh, yes. Uh-huh.
which is not in the tonality that is sung today. The Kyrie eleison was the chant of the Greek soldier returning victorious in battle to the king victory.
Okay.
We added the second verse to the Christ victory. And at the
Wow.
moment that we recognize our vulnerabilities and our need to be together to the King, to the Christ victory, it is no plea for mercy. It is no asking for God's forgiveness. It is claiming it.
Wow. I was raised Lutheran, so I know of it so deep in my bones, the liturgy of that. I
And
uh,
and that's where we start
okay.
as we move to a community of true belonging.
Mm. Just yesterday I had a conversation with someone who feels like an exile from the church. And in our Zoom call, similar to this, she was like, "Why does this feel like church?" And I said, "Well, I've, as I understand, the Hebrew word for community or was edah, and it actually has to do with a witnessing community, similar to what you just said about are we giving witness to our vulnerabilities together or not? Or are we coming together just to watch passively something happen in front? Which is not the same thing. That doesn't build community, that builds a concert crowd. But um Alexander, this has been the privilege of my month. And I know you
Uh,
don't want to hear that, but it really has been. And I really enjoyed this. Thank you.
thank you. Thank you for your heart and for what you're offering others.
Oh,
So it's so needed today.
it's true. It and it to be honest, it feels like an enormous privilege that I actually have people reaching out to me. I don't even have to reach out to people, but there's really, maybe we can say it, maybe spirit is doing something new, the ruach right now. Well, I want to say thank you so much. I will continue to pray for you. Any publication you put out, I will always enjoy thoroughly. And if it's okay, I'm going to keep quoting you in my college class. Yeah.
Please, please.
Okay.
Thank
Well,
you. Take
thank you.
care. Go well.